This is the homework helper for Chapter 6, Section 5 in the 7th grade workbook, Solving Percent Problems. So in the top 18 questions, you can see a lot of these questions look like they're kind of set up in the same manner. What we're going to do in all of these, as you saw in the instruction today, is translate that expression into an equation and then solve that resulting equation. So we have to remember how we translate these. The word of, which is in all of these, of, whenever we see it, means multiply. So whenever we see the word of, we're going to change that into a multiplication sign. Is always translates into an equal sign. So as I go through the translation, when I see is, I'll change that into an equal sign. The what phrase, you can see there is a little bit of variance here. Some of them say what number, some of them say what percent. The what phrase is always going to be your variable. X is probably what we use most of the time, but we'll change that. And as we make those changes, what we're going to see is a one-step equation that develops most of the time. Sometimes they'll actually have the things just put together and we won't even have to treat it like an equation. But once we get that one-step equation, we're going to solve that one-step equation in context and figure out the solution, and that's going to be not only the answer to the equation, but the answer to the question in general. So the approach for 1 through 18 is the same. I'm going to go ahead and take a look at 1, 2, 3, and 4 with you. So in 1, it says 50 is 40% of what number? So again, start off, you're going to translate these in order. Well, 50 is going to come out as 50. The next thing you see is the word is. Well, as we said just a moment ago, is means equals, so I'm going to put an equal sign. Then we've got 40%. Now you can literally write that as 40%, but you're going to probably end up putting that into a calculator. So if you don't know 40%, how to put that in on your calculator, probably want to go ahead and change that to a decimal at this point. It's just going to save you a step of work. So I'm going to write 0.40 here. To change a percent to a decimal, in case you've forgotten, that is a technique you're supposed to have known because we've done that already this year. You drop the percent sign and move the decimal 2 times to the left, and that's exactly what we did. The next thing says of. Well, as we said in the beginning, of means multiply, so that's going to be my times sign. And then what number here? Well, that's going to be my variable. The what phrase is always my variable. And since I'm using x for multiplication in this particular question, I'm going to use the variable y. So I've got 50 equals 0.40 times y. Now, you know from our solving processes and solving one-step equations, we would never do that because the variable's on the wrong side. But if I flip this around and clean it up, it's going to say 0.40 times y, or 0.40y, equals 50. Solve the equation. Well, keep the variable y on the left, keep the 50 on the right. That means 0.40 being a number, that's the guy that's got to go to the opposite side. How do we solve an equation? Well, when I want to move something to the opposite side of the equal sign, I do the opposite. So in this case, I'm going to divide by 0.40 because as the question is right now, I'm multiplying by 0.40. When I do 50 divided by 0.4, that's going to give me my solution. 50 divided by 0.4 is 125. So 50 is 40% of 125. All right, number 2 is almost the same thing because they're asking me again what number here. So let's translate this out in order. Number 2, 12 is the first thing they throw at us in the statement. 12 is 25% of what number? So 12 is going to pop out as 12. Then we've got is. Well, again, from our introduction, is means equals. 25%, well, we can write that again as 25%, but if we don't have a percent key on our calculator or we don't know how to use it, we're going to have to change that to a decimal, 0.25. Of is the next thing we see. That's going to be multiplication. And then the what phrase is last, what number again. So again, the what phrase is your variable. So 12 equals 0.25 times x. Solve the equation. Not a big deal. Again, we would never solve an equation like this because the variable is here on the right side. Remember, when we've solved equations all year, we've always done variables on the left. So I'm going to go ahead and flip this around and write it as 0.25x, which is the same as 0.25 times x, equals 12. We'll keep that variable on the left, keep that number on the right. So we know 0.25 is the guy that's going to move. Well, if I'm going to move it to the opposite side of the equal sign, which I am, I'm going to do the opposite. Right now, this says I'm multiplying by 0.25. So to move it, I'm doing the opposite, which is dividing by 0.25. When I take 12 and divide it by 0.25, the result there is going to be 48. So 12 is 25% of 48. All right, now even though question 3 and question 4 aren't formatted in that same way, where it's not asking me for what number is the simplest way to point out they're different, the setup idea is still going to be the same. They're asking me what percent now in questions 3 and 4, but we're still going to have to translate it as an equation because that's really the only way to do this. So let me go ahead and get rid of what's up there, or most of it here, so we can actually see the questions and have some room to do some work. Question number 3 is saying 18 is what percent of 60? All right, so we'll go ahead and start translating that. The first thing we have there is 18. Well, 18 is just going to translate as 18. Then we've got is, remember from our introduction, means equals. What percent is next? Well, your what phrase is always your variable, so that's where I'm going to drop x. Then I've got of. Well, again, going back to that introduction, of means multiplication. And then the last thing I have is 60. 60 is going to translate as 60. So I've got 18 equals x times 60. Solve for x, and that's going to be my solution. That's going to be the percent answer here that I'm looking for. So, again, just like 1 and 2, we've never solved an equation that way. So we're going to go ahead and flip this around. I'm going to write it as 60 times x. I could leave it as x times 60, but generally proper mathematics, we write the coefficient first. The coefficient here would be 60. Again, you can leave it x times 60. It's not a big deal. Equals 18. Solve the equation. How am I going to solve the equation? Well, we keep the variable on the left and keep the number on the right. So we see the troublemaker here is 60. We'll move 60 out of the way to the opposite side of the equal sign. We're going to have to do the opposite. The opposite of multiplying by 60 is to divide by 60. So I'm going to go ahead and divide by 60 to finish here. So I'm going to take 18 and divide by 60, and that's going to give me x. And when I take 18 and divide by 60, the result is 0.3. Now, in the last two questions, we were done at that point, because once we found our solution, it was the answer. But what's different about this question is it says what percent. They want this answer to be a percentage. You have the answer, but you have the answer represented as a decimal. You've got to change the decimal to a percent to say where you are, where you're supposed to be. Well, to change a decimal to a percent, as you already know, because again, we've done that this year, now take and move the decimal 2 times to the right and add a percent sign. So I'm going to take and move the decimal twice to the right and add a percent sign, and x is really 30%. So question number 3, 18 is 30% of 60. Let's try that again one more time with question number 4 before we go ahead and take a look at the story problem. 12 is what percent of 96? So we're going to go ahead and translate that in order. First thing you've got is 12. 12 is going to translate as 12. Is, well again from the introduction, is means equals. Here's your what phrase, what percent. Again, that's your variable x. Then you've got of. Of is going to mean multiply. And then 96 is going to pop out as 96. So 12 equals x times 96. Now we're going to solve the equation. Well, again, just like we saw in the last one, we've got a problem there in that we've never solved an equation with the variable on the right side. We always write the variable on the left. So I'm going to go ahead and flip the equation around and rewrite it as 96x equals 12. All right, so that's a multiplication equation now at this point. So now I'm going to go ahead and solve that by dividing. Dividing in this case now by 96. Remember, we keep the variable on the left, x, numbers on the right, 12. So the one troublemaker is 96. The one way to move it to the other, move it out of the way is to move it to the other side of the equal sign. To move something to the opposite side of the equal sign, we always do the opposite. So since this says I'm multiplying by 96, that's why I'm now dividing by 96. When I take 12 and divide it by 96, the result there is 0.125. Now again, just as I showed you in the last question, number 3, this is my answer as a decimal. But the question here says what percent. So now you want to go ahead and change this to a percentage. And again, to do that, you're going to move the decimal 2 times to the right and add a percent sign. So when I scooch that twice to the right and add a percent sign, x is really 12.5%, or in other words, 12 is 12.5% of 96.